haven't already subscribed, hit that subscribe button. That way you'll be notified whenever I upload a new episode, which I know you want that. You don't want to miss a single episode. You don't want to miss out on an opportunity to hear my dulcet tones over your podcast. So hit that subscribe button. And also leave me a 5-star rating. I appreciate all of that. And leave me a review, just a couple sentences telling people why you love this podcast so much. Now, I want to talk about the Stop Woke Act. It's getting a little bit more attention now. I mean, a lot of the fuss has died down, but now that the school year is back in session, you're seeing a lot of people talking about the Stop Woke Act and also the Parental Rights in Education Bill, which I've talked about before, and I'm sure there will still be more controversy about it going forward. But I want to focus on the Stop Woke Act. And just for those of you who don't know, this piece of legislation for the state of Florida, it is designed to prevent the teaching of elements inspired by critical race theory in the classroom, and also to prevent employers from requiring trainings that also include these ideas. Now, there's a lot of misinformation and disinformation being spread about the legislation. Overall, I support it. I do have some qualms with it. I mean, there are some areas where I think it's a little bit too vague, although a lot of that will be worked out in court, which it's already under a litigation right now in certain areas. So, like I said, there is a lot of misinformation being spread about it. A lot of people are saying, oh, this means that you can't talk about race or racial issues, or you can't talk about America's history with racism. Those are lies. Those are complete lies. There's a clear difference between what the law prohibits and actually teaching history or discussing history or discussing racial issues in the context of a corporate training. And I'll get to that in a second. But I came across this article in The Hill, and basically there are two authors, and it sounds like they're both right-leaning. They both work with a group that appears to be a conservative civil rights group. And what they contend is that the Stop Woke Act is not the best way to fight against, a lot of the woke politics that are being injected into the corporate setting, but mainly into the school system, because that's really what this is more about. And interestingly enough, I actually somewhat agree with that premise, but I don't agree with their reasoning for it. I mean, when it comes to these state level laws, especially regarding race and teaching these ideas in classrooms, they're not that effective. I mean, they've been passed in other states like Idaho and I believe Tennessee, Nebraska, some others. But there have already been reports talking about where teachers are basically admitting that they still teach the same material, they just change up the verbiage. They use different words. There was a report from Accuracy in Media where the reporter went undercover, kind of like Project Veritas, and these administrators and educators said, we have other ways to get around it, so they can subvert the law. I'm not necessarily against the law, but I do agree that it's probably not the most effective way to deal with this issue. So the authors' names are Ethan Blevins and Daniel Ortner, and what they basically contend is that it could have a problematic effect on free speech. As a matter of fact, Democrats and the activist media, they have spun this into something that would tamp down on free speech. They're trying to make it a First Amendment issue. I contend that it is not a First Amendment issue, at least not in the way that they're saying. So, in the article, they argue that laws barring businesses and schools from teaching anti-racist ideas, such as Florida's Stop Woke Act, mimic the same intolerance displayed by the woke progressives. The better path is to encourage open debate, not censorship. And some of that I might agree with, especially when it comes to the corporate setting. But when it comes to K through 12 schools, that doesn't really apply. But I'll keep going. The article also says, actually I'll back up. So just again to explain what the law does, it basically prohibits teachings in public schools and also in corporate training that promote the notion that a, quote, person, by virtue of his race, color, national origin, or sex, is inherently racist, sexist, or oppressive, whether consciously or unconsciously. It also prevents teaching that, quote, virtues such as merit, excellence, hard work, fairness, neutrality, objectivity, and racial colorblindness are racist or sexist, or were created by members of a particular group to oppress members of another group. So that last part is, I think, is a reference to Robin DiAngelo's training, and also what you see. I can't remember which museum it was. I always forget. But there was a whole board talking about how concepts like the idea of hard work or meritocracy are inherently white, that black and brown people don't ascribe to those values, which is very insulting, and in it of itself, it's racist. Like all that stuff on that list that they ascribe to whiteness and not to people of color. David Duke would agree with a lot of that. So that is problematic. But basically, under the Stop Woke Act, educators are not allowed to teach these ideas to their students, and companies cannot require their employees to participate in training that includes these views as a requirement of employment. So some of this stuff can be voluntary, but what I'm reading from it is that a company can't require that a person be subjected to those ideas as a condition of their employment. It also applies to licensing institutions. So you can't require that people applying for a certain type of license have to take these types of trainings. Now, the authors do acknowledge that the, quote, ideas that Florida seeks to suppress are bad, and that people who adhere to these ideas, quote, sow discrimination and division, blacklist dissenters, and scorn individual freedom. But their main argument is that we should not fight this illiberalism with more illiberalism. So the writers, what they say is, quote, First Amendment protects ideas that we truly hate, but that private businesses have a First Amendment right to tell their employees that all whites are privileged, oppressors, or that colorblindness is racist, though there may be some limits if training creates a hostile workplace. Let that sink in for a second. And so they continue. They say, quote, and while grade school teachers may face curriculum constraints, college professors have a First Amendment right to argue that slavery was an essential rationale behind the American Revolution, or that minorities deserve reparations from white taxpayers who played no role in their oppression. And then it says, yet under the Stop Woke Act, such speech is unlawful discrimination. And that's a word I want you to remember. And I actually do kind of agree with that part. I think it's okay to have these ideas in the university. Now, I do have a problem if they're not also presenting the other side or disallowing students from giving the other side. But in general, this is where these things should be debated. So when it comes to a free speech issue, I don't necessarily take issue with that part. And when they're talking about the rationale behind the American Revolution being to preserve slavery, that's something straight out of the 1619 Project. That's what they're referring to there. Now, they end their article by arguing that, quote, free speech is a net gain for society. I agree with that, even when it protects odious ideas. And then they bring up a case, and you might have heard of this. It happened in 1977. There was a lawyer working with the American Civil Liberties Union. His name was David Goldberger. And he defended the free speech rights of Nazis who wanted to stage a march in Skokie, Illinois. And this area had like a lot of Jewish residents, some of which were Holocaust survivors. So you can see how serious and controversial this issue was. But this lawyer still fought for their free speech rights, even though he himself was Jewish. The writers say, quote, he understood two things we must remember, that the First Amendment does not play favorites, and that truth need not fear its enemies. And I agree with that. No disagreement on that front. And I do understand their concerns about this legislation being a problem for the First Amendment and free speech. And actually, when they first proposed the law, especially when they put the text out and I read it, I was a little bit concerned about that too. I consider that possibility. I ultimately fell on the side of supporting it, because I concluded that this is not really a free speech issue. This is more of a discrimination or civil rights issue. So discrimination on the basis of race is not the same as protecting freedom of expression. So what some people assume, again, is that it doesn't allow teachers or company to discuss racial issues at all, or they can only discuss it a little bit. And I blame that on the activist media because they lied about it. That's what they do. um, Actually, it does allow teachers to talk about America's history with race. In fact, if you actually read the law, you will see that it actually mandates the teaching of the good, the bad, and the ugly. So I'll read you a little passage from the bill itself. It says, quote, quote, the history of African Americans, including the history of African peoples before the political conflicts that led to the development of slavery, the passage to America, the enslavement experience, abolition, and the contributions of African Americans to society. Instructional materials shall include the contribution of African Americans to American society. So it has to be in there. They have to talk about the slavery and the Jim Crow and all the stuff that happened. Now, what it adds on, which a lot of progressives probably wouldn't like, is that it also has to focus on the contributions of Black Americans to this country, which I think is fair. I mean, I'm not the only black person, right or left, who is tired of just hearing the history about how we got our asses kicked. They also want to talk about how we overcame a lot of that stuff. So that's fair. There's nothing wrong with that. But that is in the bill. So teachers have to teach it. It also has a passage basically saying the same thing, but in relation to the Holocaust. So here's the thing. Teachers can teach history. And I know teachers in Florida, and they were concerned about it, but you don't have to be as careful with it as they make it sound. One of the teachers I know, she teaches African American history, so she has to talk about this stuff, right? People can tell the difference between accurately discussing America's history and implying that white people, by virtue of their skin color, are inherently racist or prejudiced, and that black people, by virtue of their skin color, are naturally oppressed. Also, ascribing certain positive attributes to white people and not to black people, that's also racist too, and that is also outlawed in these schools, and you can't force employees to be subject to these messages. The bottom line is that ascribing certain attributes to an individual based on their ethnicity is not only wrong, but it's a violation of the Constitution. So again, we're talking about discrimination. We're not talking about free speech. And I'm going to get more on that in a second. So training employees and students to believe that they are somehow flawed by dint of their ethnicity or skin color is the very antithesis of what the principles that the civil rights laws are meant to uphold. These types of teachings are discrimination. Allowing these messages to persist in a place of employment, in a licensing institution, or more importantly, in a K through 12 school is wrong. Here's the thing. What would happen if a company, a university, or a K through 12 school promoted the idea that black people are inferior? What would happen if one of these institutions allowed people to use racial slurs against students or employees? We already know what would happen. They would get sued, and rightly so. As a matter of fact, Tesla is in some legal trouble because of that. They're getting sued because it's being alleged that some of their supervisors would use racial slurs and they would make blatantly racist statements to their black employees. I don't know if that's true or not. I haven't followed it that closely. I just know it's happening. But that still illustrates what I'm saying here. And some people have brought up the argument that, well, there are already laws against discrimination, so this law wasn't necessary. Honestly, they might be right about that. That's possible. But at the same time, if this law reiterates what's already there, then it's basically telling people that they can't do what they're already not allowed to do. So that's why I don't have as much of a problem with it. I do have some problems with the fact that it's kind of vague at some parts. I watched a news story about how some companies that provide diversity training are losing business, and they're having trouble formulating their lessons in a way that complies with the law. Like the issue of unconscious bias came up because the law does say that you can't imply that people are racist unconsciously. But the thing is, when you talk about unconscious bias, the way I've always heard it and the way I've always read it is that everybody has some type of unconscious bias racially or based on ethnicity or other attributes. Now, you may agree with that or you may not, but that's how I've always heard that training. It applies to everybody. So if you were to teach this, pretty much, I don't think it'd be a violation of this law because you're not teaching that just one group or one skin tone or only those with a lack of melanin are subject to unconscious bias. Now, I think what's happening is that a lot of these people follow the far left progressive definition of racism, in that black people can't be racist because racism equals prejudice plus power. I think that's what they're running into, and you know what? That's BS anyway. So I'm not having a problem with it. Now, when it comes to private organizations, I'm a little antsy on that part. I'm like, I don't know about that. I mean, so far, if it lines up with what they with the laws that are already on the books, then I don't have as much of a problem with that because you can't discriminate at a company. You can't discriminate on the basis of race or ethnicity or something else. So that's why I can, kind of be a little bit more comfortable with that. But again, this isn't an issue of free speech. And when I ran across the article, I thought it was very interesting. Their arguments are interesting, and I understand their concern. I mean, these are people who, the authors of the article, these are people who value free speech, and they don't want threats. There's already enough threats against free speech and against the First Amendment. We don't need them coming from conservatives, too. So I understand that. That's actually why I disagreed with Governor Ron DeSantis' rationale for taking Disney's favorite status away. Now, if he just did that directly, like they just shouldn't have that status, I'm fine. But it was obvious that the reason that he did that is because they spoke out against the Parental Rights and Education Bill. I do not want us getting in the habit of doing that. So hopefully he doesn't. But I think when we're talking about these laws, we need to be honest about it, and we need to have actual nuanced conversations. I would rather have a conversation about the language of the law and how that can be worked out, because, I mean, there might be some issues there. But let's not lie about it, okay? I mean, I'm not saying these authors are deliberately lying. I know they're not. This is just the way they perceive it. But there are a lot of lies out there when it comes to the Stop Woke Act. So hit me up and let me know what you think about that, and I'll see you on the other side.